of the emperor, which was Flavia. And then finally, it came back to its original name, Philadelphia. But its strategic location was because of the roads, not because it was strong in any sense. Worship at Philadelphia, Artemis was the main god that they worshiped. They also worshiped the sun god. And the practice included some very interesting things. First of all, the practice included confession of sin to a priest, a pagan priest, punishment of sin by the god, and thanks to the god, and circumstances published. Now, aren't you glad we don't live back then? You know, we all pretty much would like our mistakes not to be publicized and not to be made known. The characteristics of this city, first of all, it was the youngest of all of the seven churches, cities of the seven churches. So it was a planned city, and it was the youngest. It was the missionary city for the Greek culture. People feared another earthquake. So they were in the city. Earthquake occurs. They see that many people die in the earthquake because the buildings are falling on them. So people live outside of the city. They've actually moved from the city in the permanent dwellings into tents and temporary shelter. And then they move back into the city, and no more do they get back in the city, and there's an aftershock, another little mini earthquake, and so they are gripped with panic, and they move out again. And so what happens is that they are constantly moving outside of the city to the point where they actually live outside of the city because it was so scary to go into the city lest another earthquake occur and the buildings fall on them. And they got their name from an imperial god, and the third century title actually was Neokoros, which means temple warden, and by the 6th century it was actually known as Little Athens, because there were so many gods. The people were so panicked that they turned to as many gods as they could possibly find and built shrines to them and temples to them because they were so frightened of these earthquakes. Here is a picture of Philadelphia. When Barbara and I went to Philadelphia about 10 years ago, we were somewhat disappointed in the fact that Philadelphia is not restored very well. It's pretty much just a modern city, and there's hardly any ruins there at all to take a picture of. But we got on the bus, you know, the tour bus, and when we got to Philadelphia, our guide said to us, well, now we're going to have to eat here in Philadelphia because we've been driving for a while, and that we didn't pass any restaurants, and there are no restaurants up ahead, and it's lunchtime, and we need to satisfy your pains of hunger. So what we want you to do is just eat here in Philadelphia. Well, that's much easier said than done, because there are no restaurants in Philadelphia. But there was a bakery, and in this bakery, they had the most wonderful bread. And so I actually went behind the counter and asked the proprietor if I could take a picture, and he said yes. So I'm actually behind the counter taking a picture looking out at those who are looking in the window. And so here's the bread, and the bread was baked fresh every day. And right next to the bakery, there was what we'd call maybe a general store, and they had wonderful goat cheese that went with the bread, and they had just about any hardware type thing that you'd like, and we had a good time there. And of course, the one thing that everybody has all over the world, this store had Coca-Cola. And so we we had a Coke and goat cheese and bread, and that was our lunch, and it was pretty good. Here is about the only ruin that really has been taken care of and preserved in Philadelphia. Here's the gate where you're walking into this area, and you can see pillars on either side, and these pillars actually come from a Christian church about the 7th century, 6th or 7th century. It was St. John's Church is what it was called. And these pillars are humongous. And we'll give you another shot of them. Here are two of the pillars, and you can see in the background there's a Muslim mosque. But these two pillars, they're 2 of 6. And you can only see 3 of the pillars because that's all that's left standing. And if you look at the pillars up close, and this is paint from about the 11th century, you can see it's about 90% faded, but you can barely make out the fact that there was some paint on these pillars. They were probably painted somewhere around the 11th century. The church had frescoes that the artist put on these pillars, and that's a portion of it there. But here's just one of those 6 pillars at St. John's Church. And today, of course, it's not called Philadelphia. It's called Alashir. And the thing about this big pillar that you see, and let me just go back to it here, is can you imagine 6 of these? 6 of these huge pillars, and then it had a roof over top of it, and it was enclosed. So this is a mammoth church from the year 600 and onward, and this is all that remains of it today. Interestingly, there still is a Christian congregation in Philadelphia. The background of the city, Eusebius mentions a prophetess named Emia. Eusebius lived from about 100 to 160 A.D., and Emia was recognized as ranking with Agabus and Philip's 4 daughters. So this church evidently had the gift of prophecy in it as it's described in the New Testament. Now again, this is not from the Bible, but this is from Eusebius. But he mentions that this church had a prophetess. The 14th century, Philadelphia stood alone as a self-governing Christian city amid a Turkish land, and it survived multiple sieges until it succumbed to the Turks in about 1390. And then, of course, it became, to a large extent, a Muslim city, but there were always Christians in this city. And as I said, there still are Christians today. Here's the message to the church. Notice how the message to the church parallels the history of the city. And to the angel of the church of Philadelphia write, "He who is holy, who is true, and who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one will open, says this." And on the screen, you see an artist's conception of a 1st century key. And notice, it's a message from the one who is holy. Of course, that's God. The one who is true. There's 2 words in Greek for true. One means the opposite of false. So you have, true and false, but that's not the one that's used here. The word that's used here is true in the sense that it's real. So you have one who is holy, the one who is real, and then the one who has the King of David. So this, of course, is talking about God. More specifically, it's talking about Jesus Christ, because this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, what is the key of David?